It's great to be here, and thank you all for coming first thing in the morning. So, as Stephanie said, I'm here with Rasheed Araeen and Hoor Al Qasimi from Sharjah Art Foundation. And Rasheed is an artist, and we're going to be talking a little bit about their combined projects and together, and some of their shared interests. So, just for people who don't know Rasheed's story, he was born in Karachi in 1935 and trained as an engineer, but always wanted to be an artist. And over the course of the late 1950s and early 60s, actualized this desire. And part of that was in moving to London. And along the way, he drew on his training as an engineer in the production of artworks. And so we'll talk a little bit about his relationship to minimalism and his kind of antagonistic or agonistic relationship to the other discourse of English art and international art of the period. And then Rasheed also went on to found two influential journals, Black Phoenix in 1978, which then grew into a even more formalized journal called Third Text, which is a hugely influential academic publication looking at visual culture and art from around the globe, including Africa, South America, Middle East, Asia. So we'll talk a little bit about why he founded these journals and perhaps how he has perceived the world as it's changed over the art world and the conversation about art, how it's changed. And currently there's a retrospective of his work at the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, which is going to tour both to the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Geneva, and then also to Baltic in Gateshead, and the Garage in Moscow in the coming months and years. And the reason why Hoor is with us is because Hoor organized a 2014, not retrospective, which is exhibition, of Rasheed's practice at the Sharjah Art Foundation. And this exhibition was really the first, let's say, surveying of Rasheed's minimalist practice, and sparked this renewed interest in both Rasheed's work and also the kind of conversation around modernist art from non-Western traditions, and we kind of began this new conversation about where we are in the world and also where we are in history. So I guess I wanted to ask first, Hoor, could you just talk a little bit about how you got to know Rasheed's work and his practice? I mean, you studied in London and perhaps are more familiar with certain aspects of the London art scene or the conversation in London. I just wondered if Rasheed's work figured into that.
Thank you. Thanks, HT. Well, I studied in London, as you mentioned, but I also had seen a lot of Rasheed's work, but I couldn't place it into context. I didn't see a survey show, I hadn't seen an exhibition, and I wanted to know more. And when I met Rasheed in Sharjah, we discussed the possibility of working on a conference together. And I said, Rasheed, I really want to do an exhibition of your work because I really wanted to know more and I wanted to see more. And what was interesting is Rasheed wanted to show some of his works before and after minimalism. He wanted to show the works that were in Karachi that had never been shown before. And for me, in our part of the world, we have a very mixed community, people from South Asia, from the Middle East and Southeast Asia. So I thought if it would be important for people in our region to really know and understand the work of Rasheed, and also for myself to learn and know more. So really, that was the starting point.
And maybe Rasheed, if you want, we could also ask you to talk about what you wanted to do with this exhibition in Sharjah in 2014. I mean, the exhibition really centers around the minimalist element of your practice, and it would be great to hear from you about kind of how you are thinking about presenting your work in relationship to what people already know about minimalism, how it's commonly talked about.
You have asked many questions.
All right.
Let me go before how I met Hoor. I heard about Hoor, what she was doing in Sharjah. So I wrote to her with the proposal for a conference about Islamic scholarship. I don't remember now whether I got any response or not.
Maybe later.
However, I was in the Dubai Art Festival in 2013, and I was attending a talk where Hoor was there. So I went to her and said hello. And I said to her, I know who you are, but you don't know about me. She said, no, I know you. That was the beginning of our conversation, and we exchanged emails, and then she proposed the show at Sharjah. Given the limited space available, I thought it would be a good idea to show a selection of my work, 60s work in London, and what I did in Pakistan. I have a problem with the word minimalism. And I think minimalism also has a problem with me. I will come to that later. My journey towards realization of symmetry in geometry was very different from the way minimalism in New York developed. The work of minimalists came from their studies from art history, study of art history, looking at work, what has gone before, going back to Russian constructivists, Malevich, Mondrian, and then, of course, the work of David Smith. So they had a body of knowledge in front of them, which they had to deal with the question, how could they go forward and beyond what has happened, already happened historically. My case was very different. First, I was classified by European discourse as the other, living in a periphery. It was not just a periphery, but a city Karachi, where there were no art school, there was no art gallery, there was no art museum. All what we had, few books imported from the West about modernism. Mostly about the work of Picasso, Matisse, Barclay, etc. There was no knowledge about Russian constructivism, Dadaism, Surrealism, let alone Duchamp. So it was this atmosphere I found myself. However, in the 50s, I wasn't concerned. My practice as an artist began with what I have been taught in the school. That is to draw and paint what to see. And that's what I did in the 50s. In the early 1958, I did a series of watercolors of boats in Karachi Harbor, which eventually led me to look at their shape in a geometric form, out of which came the work which I don't know we have to show, which comprise of vertical, horizontal, or diagonal lines. That was the beginning of my interest in geometry. I did a body of work based on that discovery of geometry until 1962. Then I visited the city of Hyderabad, which is 150 kilometers from Karachi. I was fascinated by the architecture there, particularly the wind towers. It has been the tradition in that part of the world to build wind tower on top of the houses to allow the air to go into the house and keep the house cool. What fascinated me was the form of the wind tower, which comprised one side a rectangular shape, on both sides but the triangles. I'm saying this only because I have analyzed this in later on. At that particular time, I was just fascinated by the shapes. When I came back to Karachi, I began to work around that shape. And I developed further the idea of geometry. So, to cut the story short, what I'm saying that my work came from my experience of my life in Karachi and around Karachi. It wasn't by reading art books and looking at the work of the artists who have been done similar work. So when I reached London in '64, when I came across the work of Anthony Caro, my immediate response was fascination. At that time, I didn't know what fascinated me, but later I realized it must be the geometry. However, to be fascinated by someone who wouldn't be enough to fulfill your ambition to make a sculpture. I had to wait until my imagination began to work towards something new. In '65, I hit upon the idea of organizing geometry in a symmetrical manner. The first drawing I made was a pile of girders arranged symmetrically. So that was the beginning of what historians began to look later on as a minimalist. However, when I showed my work in 1969 and 70, some people thought it was Islamic art. Others thought it was minimalism. As far as the establishment was concerned, they ignored it. However, the dilemma I was in at that time, because I have never been interested in Islamic art. And I spent the rest of my life opposing the idea that my work had to do something with Islamic. However, recently I have changed my mind, and I think I will go further after your next question.
We'll give you a rest for a moment. So when you talk about this being kind of ignored by the mainstream art establishment in London at the time, I mean, you were, I think, quite aware of the kind of racist undertones, or maybe even overtones of the time. And so you, when you published your own catalog of your works called "Making Myself Visible," and you developed in a way this idea of visibility in relation to what was happening in the conversation about art in the UK at the time. So I was just wondering if you could kind of explain a little bit about why, first of all, you wanted to or felt the need to publish a catalog, and then about your own relationship to visibility in, say, the UK or also the region or the world. You know, how has your visibility changed? Do you still feel like you aren't visible, or do you feel visible now, today?
But that book you have mentioned, Making Myself Visible, was published in '84. Exactly 20 years I have been in London. During that time, I had done many things. I pursued the idea of geometry and symmetry in the sculpture until I faced indifference, not only indifference, but hostility towards my work in London. What I was baffled was not that nobody admired my work. There were people who admired my work, who were fascinated by my work, including a very important gallery, which is now world famous gallery. I won't mention their name. So I was confused, baffled. In one gallery who was very fond of my work, and they said, I repeat their word, we love your work. When I asked them, when are you going to show me? They said, sorry, we can't show you. I said, why not? They said, we only show American and English artists. That means they could only show white artists. Anyway, my experience of the art world in London was shattering. And I was so confused and puzzled, baffled. I didn't know what to do, how to carry on with my work, which led me reading. And by chance, I came across the work of Fanon. It was Fanon who showed me that what I faced was not something to do with the individual attitude of people towards me or my work, but it was the colonial condition. It was this awareness that I had come to a city which was still the center of the empire. And then, with the advice of some friends, I joined Black Panthers. I began to write. I began to distribute leaflets, took part collective activities with David Medalla, did performances. In '78, I began publishing a journal called Black Phoenix because I realized what we needed was a platform, a collective platform where all those whose work was suppressed can speak up. Then I got involved at the activities. However, after doing all the work, I remained invisible. I had no place within the British art world. So I thought maybe it was the time to collect all my writings, all my work which I had done in London and put them together and let the people know what I had done in 20 years, which led to the publication of the book you have mentioned.
And what about these days, say 25, well, sorry, almost 35 years later? How do you feel about your visibility in the art world today?
Well, I'm visible at the time, invisible. I don't know. When I say I'm visible, I'm known. I'm known in the London art world. The institution know my existence. But at the same time, I'm excluded from their programs. So I'm, other way, invisible. There's no exhibition, historical exhibition in England of the last 50 years in which I have been included. That's what I mean by invisibility.
Hoor, maybe I could bring you back into this conversation by asking you about Sharjah Art Foundation and how, as an institution, you're thinking about artists' visibility or invisibility, and what kind of perspective the institution wants to give to individuals.
I think with the Sharjah Art Foundation, we have not just a responsibility, but a need to look at the international art scene, not only look towards the West or look at it from a Western point of view. And for me, it's a great privilege to meet artists like Rasheed and others who we've worked with and gotten to know their work better. Sometimes I feel it's a little bit selfish because I get to spend time with them and learn a lot, but also to introduce it to a growing art scene. We're in a region that's so accessible with people from all over the world visiting, and if we can add to the conversation of art history and what art history is from our part of the world, I think that's really important.
Rasheed, did a similar kind of impetus drive the founding of Third Text to giving visibility to artists from the non-West?
Well, there was the time when I began to write in the 70s. It was the visibility, invisibility, not of me alone. It was not the issue of an individual like me. It was the collective issue. It was the issue about divided world. On the one side was the world which was once imperial world, and the what we can call post-imperial world. Sometimes it is called third world. In the 70s, and when I began to write, there was no visibility of any artist from Africa, Asia, or even from Latin America. The art history books but only about the European and North American artists. But now the situation has changed in the last 20 years. Artists from all over the world are now visible. They are visible. They are everywhere. But there are different kinds of visibilities. One can be visible without being defined and legitimized as a subject of history. Those who are being celebrated today under globalization are, of course, being celebrated, but they still exist out of art history. Art history continues to be the history of the achievement of white European or North American artists. So what I'm trying to say, there's a visibility and invisibility. There's the inclusion at the same time exclusion.
You said something to me the other night that was a nice formulation about how you see a lot of younger artists developing a relationship to their place, where they come from, about where you stand and where you look, and in maybe you could remind me exactly of the formulation about standing in one place and looking out, and not just looking at the place you're standing.
Well, to answer your question, I think I can say that what we are talking about here was awareness. Establishment was aware of it all along. When magician de la Terre was done in Paris in 1889, they knew the issue of visibility and invisibility. But they justified on the basis that in exclusion of artists from the rest of the world was because modernism in Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world was not genuine or legitimate. It was derivative. What the Centre Pompidou looking for was a genuine artwork. In their view, genuine artwork in Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world was still based on their own traditions, not what they do as a modern art. What happened in this exhibition called Magicians de la Terre was, it was divided 50-50. 50 artists from Europe and North America who were part of modern art history, and other 50 from Africa, Asia, who followed their own tradition. This division now exists in terms of artists working within own national boundaries. They don't have to follow their own tradition. They can follow Dusha. So long, so what they do relate to their own culture, their own nationalities, that by which your question relates to the idea of geography. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I was just interested to, because you were reflecting on some of the art that you'd seen this week at the fair, and you know how younger artists were negotiating their own identities. And you said something about how you felt like a lot of younger artists were just looking at the place they were standing and not really developing a kind of practice that acknowledged where they were from necessarily, but also thought beyond that.
But they are doing what the art market wants from them. They want them
Which is?
to carry their art card. So they are doing this, and they are quite successful. And if you want to be successful Chinese artist, you must say something about China. If you want to be Indian artist, and you want to be successful, you must say something about India.
But in certain ways, do you think that's a bit of a generational change between a kind of maybe modernist idea of an international conversation that doesn't give such weight to local conditions?
Well, it is a generational question, but I don't think it is only generational, because when the West opened its doors to the artists from Africa, Asia, they knew what was expected from them. If we go into post-colonial theory, you will find enough material about the identity. In Britain, idea of ID was promoted by people like Stuart Hall and Homi Bhabha, who become a very important figure within the establishment. And some artists began to think that was the way to be successful. So, for example, the non-white artists who were recognized in the 90s in Britain, they all carried with them their ID card. Those who didn't remain invisible.
It's actually something, Hoor, that you do with Sharjah.
I'm simplifying things.
Of course.
Of course. The whole relationship is very complex, because I haven't gone into the nature of Eurocentric art history. Why Eurocentric art history is still dominant, why it still is the basis of legitimation within art history. That is the issue which has been avoided by the art institutions. And artists are left on the mercy of the art market.
Well, from my perspective, that's the gift and the potential in an institution like Sharjah Art Foundation, where there is a potential to have a different kind of conversation and write a different history. So, I mean, I find it very fitting, actually, that the two of you met and had this exhibition together in the way that, I mean, Hoor is very interested in, for example, preserving modernist architecture in the Emirates, which is something that you were talking about just now, about modernist architecture from the non-West being kind of, or modernist art being kind of denigrated as not being authentic. But in Sharjah, for example, you have all these preservation of 1970s and 80s structures, which otherwise people are overlooking. So I think it's interesting that there's this awareness that also non-Western modernisms now need to be preserved in order to really start having a better history of the period. Do you see that as well, Rasheed? Do you think that we could rewrite modernism by looking at its influences from outside of the West?
I don't know if I can answer that question.
Maybe we should actually let the audience ask a few questions, if there are some. Well, in the meantime, if you'd like to answer that question, you can, of course.
I did good. Sure.
I was asking about the potential to kind of reformulate an idea of modernism by looking at non-North American, non-European examples. Whether you think that's possible.
Well, the modernism can come from different experiences, you see. As I told my own story, my modernism, although I was aware of Western modernism, I was also made to believe modernism was something progressive and advanced thing. But I didn't need to follow whatever happened in the West. If one can keep one's imagination free and respond to one's own experience of life, one can develop a different modernism from the modernism which might be in New York or Paris or Milan or Berlin. We don't have to follow their models. Whether they're rooted in their own culture or not is a different question. Their own culture can play a role in it, but without representing it, by which I mean without representing their own culture.
I think we have a question in the front.
I was thinking that...
Do you mind just, sorry, there's a microphone coming, so yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. I was thinking that nowadays, even in the Western world, you see a lot of art by artists from the rest of the world, but often it's really very decontextualized, almost by being moved to a different place. It's decontextualized from the place against which it was made, but also it's decontextualized historically, because often the new audience in the West don't understand the history of the places where it was made. And I feel a lot of the problem is not about contemporary art, but more about modern art, that we need to somehow change the story of how modernism is told in order to really break things down. Just adding in some contemporary artists from the non-Western world doesn't really strike at the foundations in the same way. And I'm wondering, my question would be, I wonder how you think about the strategy of Tate Modern, because now, compared, say, to many other major Western museums, Tate actually has started to put a lot of works by non-Western artists. Everything's comparative, but there's a lot more there than in many Western museums. But yet their strategy seems very fragmented. You know, in the old days, you'd have a historical narrative of how art developed. But now, because we don't have such a narrative told through the way the art is displayed, it isn't possible to break down the assumptions about such a narrative, which are still there, actually. And I wonder what you think about how far they have gone and whether it's successful in its strategy.
How far?
Tate Modern, and how it's included more non-Western art, and what do you think of that strategy, how they've gone about it?
I didn't get your gist of the question.
How do you think Tate Modern are showing this international art scene? What do you think of what they're doing, their strategy?
I don't know what they're doing.
Okay.
Let me put the problem differently, because you talk about the Western, non-Western art. There is no such thing as a non-Western art. We are being sucked into the same discourse, and there is a hierarchy of discourse based on racial subjectivity and the perception of the other is still there, because the West hasn't gone through decolonization, and since the power still lies with the West.
But maybe try and ask my question in a slightly different way. How much is the answer to be something that can be done through exhibition, or is it really that it's more a matter of we have to do the work in art history to change the story? Where is the site where we can make the most difference? I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. And what are the strategies at this point which would be the most effective in making a difference at this moment?
Well, let me put it differently. Production of art is the production of knowledge. The question then is who and how that knowledge is legitimized. We haven't got anything except Eurocentric artists to legitimize that knowledge. If Eurocentric artistry is not enough to legitimize whatever happened all over the world, we have to look for an alternative. An alternative is not going to come from Europe or North America. It will have to come from those who have been excluded from art history. By which I mean, if there is a revision, if we need a revision of modern art history, we have to revise ourselves looking at modernism from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America. And we have to write it. We can't expect Europe to write something which goes against them.
I think that might be a good place to end for the moment, and hopefully we can all continue this conversation also after the talk, but in time to come. So thank you to Hoor, and thank you to Rasheed, and thank you Stephanie and Art Basel for bringing us together. Thank you.